The title of this video might be a little clickbaity, but stick with me because the answer to this question is actually pretty interesting, and it's one that I get asked all the time in some form or another. When most people think of the first pharaoh, they're probably thinking about Narmer, the supposed unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, who has traditionally dated to around 3150 BC and is often depicted with the famous red crown and the crook and flail symbols of kingship and the divine right to rule. But as with a lot of things in Egyptology, the answer isn't quite so simple. For one thing, the traditional date of 3150 BC is just that, traditional. It comes from a very rough timeline that was established in the early 20th century by the Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, who was also responsible for putting together the first ever chronological list of pharaohs, which is known as the Breasted Chronology. And while his list has been incredibly useful and is still used by many Egyptologists today, it is important to remember that it is just a theory based on the evidence available at the time. And it hasn't been universally accepted, especially in more recent years. There have been quite a few revisions of the chronology, the most recent of which put the traditional start of the dynastic period, and therefore the reign of the first pharaoh several centuries later than Breasted originally proposed. The evidence for these revisions comes primarily from new radiocarbon dates and the study of Egyptian pre-dynastic and early dynastic pottery. But even with these new dates, the question of who was the first pharaoh isn't as straightforward as it might seem. That's because being pharaoh wasn't necessarily a hereditary title like we might think of it today, but rather more of a job title or a function held by a member of the royal court. In other words, the term pharaoh didn't initially refer to a king, but rather to a member of the king's court whose job it was to act as the divine representative of the king. The pharaoh would have been responsible for maintaining the king's relationship with the gods and making sure that they remained happy. This could include performing religious ceremonies, making offerings to the gods, and ensuring that the king's funerary rites were carried out correctly. Over time, the powers and responsibilities of the pharaoh would change, and eventually the title would become hereditary, passing from father to son and eventually becoming attached to the throne itself, so that every king of Egypt was also pharaoh and every pharaoh was king. But it wasn't always like this. So if Narmer was not the first pharaoh, then who was? Well, unfortunately, we don't know for sure. The earliest record we have of the name Pharaoh isn't even from Egypt. It comes from a stele found at Sarabat el-Kaden in the Sinai, where it appears in a hieroglyphic inscription that records the visit of an Egyptian pharaoh to the site in the late 4th millennium BC. The only problem is we can't be certain who this pharaoh was, though it may have been a contemporary of Narmer's. What's more, the title doesn't appear again in the archaeological record for almost 2.5 centuries. It resurfaces during the reign of Akhenaten, though whether he was the first pharaoh to bear the title exclusively as part of his royal titulature is also open to debate. After him, the title seems to disappear once more until we get to Ramesses II, who also bears the title on some of his monuments. From this point on, the title seems to become attached to the king's divine consort as well, with many great royal wives also bearing the title. So as you can see, trying to pin down the first pharaoh is a bit trickier than you might think. We have a pretty good idea of when the term first started to be used, but exactly who was using it and what their status was is still up for debate. Unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that Egyptologists are still working on, and there isn't yet a definitive answer. But that's the fun of Egyptology. There's always something new to discover. I hope you enjoyed learning a little something about the history of the word pharaoh. If you did, please make sure you subscribe for more videos.